Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. Tonight I want to talk about a book called Silence by Shusaku Endo. This is a book I've been meaning to read for a long time now, but recently the Japanese Literature Challenge hosted by Dolce Bellezza and the Classics Club Challenge, which I just recently joined, seemed like a great opportunity to actually stop procrastinating and read this Japanese novel. Since this is a historical fiction novel centered around themes of Christianity, specifically missionaries and martyrdom, there will be a lot of religious references in this video, and I will be reading from the Bible at various points, so just a heads up if that's not your cup of tea, but I hope it will prove to be interesting and informative. I also want to say that I'm not trying to be preaching in this video. This is not going to be a theological review. I'm not going to be giving a ton of opinions. I want to present the facts of this book and let you draw your own conclusions. But to start out with, I'm going to be going over some biblical background and also historical context. So first of all, what is this book, Silence, about? It was published in 1966, and it was written by Shusaku Endo, who was a Japanese Catholic author. And this author also wrote a novel called The Sea and Poison, which is a novel I reviewed a few years ago and was deeply impressed with. So I came into Silence expecting that same high caliber of writing, and in that regard, I was not disappointed. Silence takes place in the 1600s in Japan, and it's about these Catholic missionaries who, under extreme conditions and horrible tortures, renounce their Christian faith. At the same time questioning, why does God remain, quote, silent during times of persecution, and why does he not appear to intervene when his people are suffering? So that is the basic premise of the story, the moral dilemma at the center of this novel. Before I go any further into that, I wanted to go over some Bible verses, some biblical context to get us sort of grounded in what this involves from a Christian perspective. So first, let's look at some verses that talk about the seriousness of denying your Christian faith. The first one would be from Matthew 10. This is the New King James Version for anyone who's interested. There is a lot in this chapter about persecution. He says, "But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you should speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you." Verse 32, "Therefore whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." Also in 1 John chapter 2, "Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father either. He who acknowledges the Son has the Father also." And then the last one is from Revelation. "And he said to me, 'It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." So, as you can see from scripture. It is a very serious thing to deny your faith if you are a Christian. What I do want to say, though, is the verse that really brings me hope when I think about the potential of being persecuted for my faith and being faced with moral dilemmas that might make me want to deny my faith. The verse that I really hold on to, and which I think we need to remember as we read Silence, is from 1 Corinthians. And he says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge for yourselves what I say." So the next piece of biblical context I wanted to mention before diving into the historical context is the two types of characters that come up in this novel. There's the Peter type and the Judas type. And I think it's good to sort of go back to the stories of Judas and Peter and understand what's the difference between them. As I was reading this, I felt that the book somewhat muddies the waters between the Judas type and the Peter type. But let's be very clear that Peter and Judas are two very different individuals in Jesus' life, and therefore in literature, I think they should be those delineations between the two types should be very clear. So just recap here, I'm sure familiar for many of you watching. Peter was, of course, one of Jesus's closest apostles, and after being warned by Jesus he would deny Jesus, he did deny Christ 3 times as he was watching Christ being tortured and abused. Peter watched, and when he was asked, "Do you have any association with this man?" he denied it. Later, Peter repented and ultimately became the leader of the early church, according to Catholics, the first pope. I should say I'm not Catholic, but this review, I want to stay laser focused on this novel. So I'm not necessarily going to be looking at this from a Catholic lens, but it is important to understand how Peter is perceived from a Catholic perspective. And then I should add that according to early accounts, Peter was crucified under the Roman Emperor Nero. Judas, on the other hand, was also one of the 12 apostles. He was their treasurer, but we are told in one of the Gospels that he was stealing money from the treasury, and as is well known, he sold Jesus to the Pharisees for 30 pieces of silver, and then in anguish he returned the money to the Pharisees and hanged himself. As I mentioned a moment ago, there are distinct differences between Peter and Judas, and these are really important to understand as you're reading Silence. I am not going to go into those differences in depth personally. I'm not a pastor or a priest, but I will link to you a few articles and videos that you can watch which delineate some of those differences and help you get an understanding of why we need to be very careful when viewing these two biblical figures. One is by Billy Graham, the other is by John Piper, both Protestant ministers. And then I included one video by Pastor Wang Yi from China. And unfortunately, the video featuring Wang Yi is incomplete. It's not his entire sermon. It's a clip. But I wanted to highlight Pastor Wang Yi because he is an example of someone who is currently being persecuted for his Christian faith. A couple years ago, he wrote letters from a Chengdu jail. He was already imprisoned by the Chinese authorities for speaking out against their human rights abuses. And most recently, this past December, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. I think we should keep the example of Wang Yi in our minds. I want to read this bit from his letter that he wrote in 2018. Those who lock me up will one day be locked up by angels. Those who interrogate me will finally be questioned and judged by Christ. When I think of this, the Lord fills me with a natural compassion and grief toward those who are attempting to and actively imprisoning me. Pray that the Lord would use me, that he would grant me patience and wisdom, that I may take the gospel to them. Separate me from my wife and children, ruin my reputation, destroy my life and my family. The authorities are capable of doing all of these things. However, no one in this world can force me to renounce my faith. No one can make me change my life, and no one can raise me from the dead. So, moving on from biblical background, let's get into the historical background, which is, I think, what most people are looking to learn more about as they read this novel. So, brief history of Christianity in Japan. Francis Xavier was a Catholic who first brought Christianity to Japan in the mid-1500s. In the space of about 3 decades after that, the Japanese Christians grew in number to about 150,000. And then, at that point, an Italian missionary named Alessandro Valignano arrived in 1579, and he set about making numerous reforms to the Jesuit missions that were already there. He started a new policy of making sure the missionaries learned Japanese, as well as making sure the Japanese were treated with more respect and that these missionaries were also learning the Japanese customs. So for about the next 30 years after that, Christianity was allowed and to some extent encouraged in Japan. In 1587, 6 missionaries and 20 Japanese Christians were crucified by the order of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was a powerful ruling daimyo, or feudal lord. And Hideyoshi, as I understand it, was very paranoid about the political implications of the Christians, and so he took it out by slaughtering these innocent people. And this was the beginning of nearly 2 decades of sporadic violence against Christians in Japan. It really culminated in 1614 when Christianity was completely banned by the Tokugawa shogunate. This was the military government which ruled from 1600 to 1868. By this time, however, there were already 300,000 Christians in Japan, and they already had an entire infrastructure of seminaries, hospitals, and other institutions. So when this law was passed, it triggered new waves of persecution and resulted in many more martyrdoms. And some Christians did denounce their faith or practiced it secretly. So it's in this atmosphere of immense persecution and hardship that is the setting of the novel Silence. I'm not going to go too much into the kinds of things that these Christians were subjected to by the Tokugawa shogunate, but I will mention a few of them because they play a big role in the story. As I mentioned before, they were crucified, they were boiled alive in these hot springs at this Mount Unzen, they were burned at the stake, and the form of torture that was referenced in this book was hanging them by their feet in a pit of excrement and basically allowing them to slowly die through the pressure that it exerted on their brains. So one article I read called Nagasaki, the Rome of Japan, and I would say that is a very pertinent analogy. you can think of this time as being much like the horrible persecutions happening in Rome. One of the things that was done that was to try to get people to apostatize or renounce their faith was to have them trample on an image of Christ and or the Virgin Mary. And this was called fumie. That is the act that these priests in this novel are being tempted to commit.